So welcome. Great to see so many of you. I would say familiar faces, but I can't see all of your faces. That's okay. Welcome to this first in a new IUFRO Division 6 webinar series. My name is Cecil Konijnendijk. I think I know most of you. I'm working as a professor of urban forestry at UBC in Vancouver, and I'm running a company called the Nature-Based Solutions Institute together with my good friend and colleague Johan Usberg, who's also on this call. And as you know, my focus of work has been primarily on urban forestry and on greening cities. So the idea with this webinar series is really to use an hour of our Friday every second month or so to highlight a key topic that affects forests, the social aspects of forest and forestry in a broad sense. And today, of course, as you will realize, we'll look at urban areas and we look very much also at public spaces and not just forests. We have a really excellent lineup today. We have 4 speakers that represent very different parts of the world and that have done some of the really exciting studies on the importance of nature, urban nature during the COVID pandemic. And actually, we just had our 1-year celebration, or celebration is maybe not the right word, of the global pandemic. And I guess many of us were still in lockdowns or in restricted situations. And I think we all have experienced firsthand how important nearby green space is for us. So the speakers will talk a lot about that. They will present their work from Europe, from North America, from Asia, Southeast Asia. And actually the last speaker will actually draw some really interesting lines, I think, for maybe some of the consequences looking ahead of all of this for our public spaces, for the way we design and plan our cities. So I would like to ask you to put your questions in the Q&A, in the comments, in the bottom, in the chat. So at the end, we hope that we have a bit of time to pick up on a few of those. I will, to keep the time, I will field those questions to our speakers. So I would like to ask you to keep yourself muted as people are speaking. And as I said, just put your comments, your thoughts in the chat. Just do that as you want as we go along. Great, so thanks again for joining. And I would like to introduce then our first of 4 excellent speakers, Dr. Francesca Ugolini, an old colleague of mine, not an old, but a colleague I know for many, many years from Italy, working with the Italian Research Council and doing a lot of interesting work on soil-plant atmosphere relations, but that's not so much the focus today. And actually Francesca has been doing a lot of general or studies that relate to general aspects of urban forest and urban green spaces. And she has also been heavily involved in a series of European projects. So Francesca, thanks so much for joining us. And I would invite you to share your really interesting work on COVID and urban forest, urban nature.
Thank you, Cecil, for inviting. It's an honor for me to be here. And this is the title of the presentation, and it will concern the results and the reflections coming out from a survey that was carried out in some European countries at the time of the first wave of the coronavirus 1 year ago. And as you remember, Italy was the first country in the Western part, let's say, of the world to face the presence of the COVID-19. And during the first month, the rise of the contagion pushed the government to set an escalation of restrictive measures. Firstly, establishing the lockdowns in the northern parts of the regions, which were, which accounted a lot of positive cases. And then after a couple of weeks, extending the lockdown to the whole nation. So, and it was March 9. During that time, we approached completely new behavioral rules, as you know. So it was the springtime. So those many people started visiting parks and gardens, and as a way to escape the closure, and the government decided to close them to avoid the risk of people gathering, and while sport and physical activity was allowed only near the residents. And we are at the same situation right now, actually. So the idea of the survey started while I was looking outside from my window, and luckily I have my neighbor's garden to watch, and watching on the media the images and videos of wild animals visiting cities, as you remember. So 3 questions arose in my mind. How was the lockdown changing our habits in relation to the green areas? To what extent people, I should close this. To what extent did people miss the visiting urban green spaces? and how would citizens like to see their own towns? So that was the time when I called Giovanni Sanesi, that you might know, and he's an Italian expert in the field of urban green infrastructure. And I shared my thoughts with him, and he agreed to start an exploratory survey. So at the beginning, the questionnaire, was prepared and delivered through our mailing list, friends, networks, and thanks to a snowball effect, we got many respondents, about 1,000 just in a few days. And since it was circulating in Facebook, some colleagues from other European countries got interest in spreading the questionnaire also in their own country. So it was translated into national languages, and Croatia, Slovenia, Spain, Israel, and Lithuania joined. So we started, collecting responses from April, more or less the middle of April, up to the end of the first lockdown. And obviously the data cannot be considered representative of the national populations, but however, they give an idea of the behavioral changes in relation to the green spaces, and give also thoughts about from those people who are actually visitors of urban green spaces. We got about 2,500 respondents, mostly living in big towns, and on average, 90% were people who declared to visit urban green spaces at least a few times a year. During the lockdown, the majority of urban green spaces visitors did not go to the green spaces, especially in those countries where the restrictions were more severe, like in Italy and in Spain. You can see the 36%. While in other countries, they went a higher number because there were not so many restrictions. And regarding the frequency of visitation, in Italy and Spain, again, the majority of those who did visit green areas went less than once a week, while in other countries, more than 50% could go more than once a week, actually. There was a change also in the travel distance. In fact, the main changes were observed in those countries where the restrictions set the maximum distance from home for physical exercise. So for instance, in Italy, in Spain, and in Israel, we couldn't go farther than, say, 100 or 200 meters, 200 meters in Italy. So there was an increase of the visitation of green areas that were at closer distance, and the decrease, obviously, of visitation of green spaces that were at farther distances. And regarding the type of green space that was visited, well, before the pandemic, the urban parks were in general the most visited type of green spaces. And during the lockdown, there was a general decrease in the visitation, which was much more significant, say, in Croatia and in Italy. Although no statistically significant, there was a tendency to visit green areas out of the town. And in addition, in Spain, there was also an increase of visitation of tree-lined streets, which was probably due to the fact that it was closer home. So some changes were related, let's say, to local or to specific countries, but we are not able to say the reasons, say, of these changes. And regarding the activities, the most selected motivation to go to a green space before the pandemic, in almost all countries except Lithuania, it was for physical exercise. And it increased even more during the lockdown. But the green spaces provide also a place for relaxing, especially in time of pandemic, and also place for walking with the dog outside. But during the pandemic, during the lockdown, there was a strong decrease of all those activities that can be considered not essential, like taking the kids outdoors or meeting people or observing nature. And then we asked in the survey, To what extent did respondents miss green space access? So it's not surprising that the green spaces were missed mostly by respondents living in those countries with the most severe restrictions and regulations. And actually, we also asked if the green view from the window could make an effect, like, let's say, to decrease the deprivation feeling. But we didn't find any relationships except for the wide view of a natural landscape. So this seems to reduce, let's say, this feeling of deprivation. And regarding the activity that were missed during the lockdown, we can say that exercising outdoors, enjoying times outdoors, meeting people, observing nature, or simply breathing fresh air were missed by respondents, with some specific activities typical of some countries. Like in Spain, they missed physical exercise and meeting people in Slovenia. Then finally, we asked respondents to take a few minutes to reflect on the relationship between people, urbanization, and nature in the city during the lockdown. And we really got a lot of text, a lot of sentences. It was like people really enjoyed, sharing their thoughts. So these texts were translated into English from the national language. And then we tried to identify the main concept, and the concepts were gathered together under the same under a category, and then the categories were gathered under top level categories. So yeah, so what we saw is that most of the respondents wrote about governance, especially regarding planning and management, about cities, but also green spaces. And also, there were a lot of sentences related to the awareness. So like a consciousness of the importance of green spaces in general, and also about the benefits that these green spaces provide, but also the importance of education. So 39 concepts were extracted, were identified, and the top 5 concepts were related to, for instance, to the integration of urban green spaces in the built environment, but also the increase of the surface of urban green spaces, as well as the importance of green spaces for health and well-being, but also providing happiness. Another, say, group or respondents communicated, the importance to have a better maintenance of these spaces, and also the education to increase awareness. So to conclude, despite the exploratory nature of the survey, the results identify the needs of urban dwellers and users of green spaces. For instance, they need accessible green spaces near home, which in a way enhances also the green mobility, like walking, and have also positive effects like physical benefits and well-being. The green spaces must be designed responding to the user's needs, even in time of lockdowns. So which means allowing different types of activities like sport, playing, observing nature, meeting people, and increase also the variety of green spaces typologies and of their natural elements, for instance, increasing the biodiversity. Enhance the green spaces with amenities and services, obviously, for benches, tools for kids, depending, on the motivation to go to the space. And from the text analysis, we understood that people are really aware of the fact that we need greener towns. So less paving, more green spaces, promoting, for instance, land compensation or building, let's say, compensation, and increasing pocket greenery in order to have green spaces closer home, but also increasing the surface of parks or green spaces in general, which is probably connected to the fact that we can walk and we can run in green spaces. Also, the quality of green space planning and maintenance is very important, which means enhancing the accessibility, having better maintenance in terms of vegetation and cleaning up from rubbish, but also improving, the security. And last, but not less important, is adult and young people education, which means raising awareness for the respect of nature, but also for the public goods. All these results, what I gave is just a synthesis of what is published in this paper, which is accessible from the journal Urban Forest and Urban Greening. And it was made together with other authors from countries that I mentioned. And this is the end of my talks. I would like, if you don't mind, Cecil, to communicate that I was invited together with David to open a special issue on the topic by the journal MDPI Land. So for anyone that want to still publish on the topic, we're welcome to send contributions.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Francesca, for that really interesting talk and fascinating to see results from countries that are quite different as well. So we saw even Israel, we saw Chile in there. So some really nice patterns there. So as I mentioned earlier, feel free to put your comments in the chat. We will move on to our next speaker, not to lose too much time. And I'm really delighted that we have Dr. Clara Pregitzer with us. So we're actually moving from Europe now to North America, to the New York area. And Clara is a Deputy Director of Conservation Science at the Natural Areas Conservancy, I should say, which is an NGO in New York. And she's trained as a forest ecologist, but has really started focusing a lot on urban forested natural areas. So the role of more natural areas within the urban forest. And has done that for 14 or 50 years or so, of which the largest part of her work in New York City. So Clara, thanks for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be here, and thank you, Cecil, for inviting me. I'm calling in from New York City, as he mentioned, in my apartment here in Brooklyn, where I've been spending most of the lockdown. My email address is there, and there's a link also to our website. I won't spend too much time introducing the organization I work for, but like Cecil said, I'm based in New York City with a nonprofit. We have a report on this work located on our website, as well as some other materials. So please feel free to email me with any questions or follow up on our website. So most of my work really focuses on urban natural areas, and I wanted to just take a moment to introduce what urban natural area is before I spend the next few minutes speaking about it. So many people might be familiar with the urban forest, which includes tree canopy across all different urban contexts. So trees growing in the streets, in backyards and landscape parks. And our organization and my work has specifically focused on forested natural areas, which are woods within the city, or places that really look and feel like the woods. And they really require different management and care, but can provide a lot of really unique benefits in the urban context. So this is a picture of Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx, where I had my first job in New York City studying vegetation. Could not believe that that this was New York City. Here's a picture of forests in Seattle, Washington, Indianapolis, Indiana, and Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Jacksonville, Florida. So this is just to give you a sense of these natural areas exist and are prevalent in cities across the world. And I work mostly here in New York City, but have also been coordinating with cities in the US. So forested natural areas are a valuable resource. And in COVID, we really realized that they were a unique type of urban parkland that was good for socially distanced use. So people could get outside, stay apart from each other, different than a playground or places that could be incredibly crowded. So we saw our natural areas were seeing a lot of increase in use. A few other facts about natural areas. So they're a dominant type of parkland in the US. 68% of parkland in the 100 most populous cities are dominated by natural areas. They're in New York City, they're a minority of the tree canopy. So they're just a quarter of the total tree canopy, but they have a high concentration of trees. So a lot of big trees and trees growing close together. So they account for 65% of the total trees in the city and 69% of the carbon stored. So there's a multitude of unique social and ecological benefits. They provide habitat, are really important for, you know, places for people to visit and have a sense of unique local nature. So when COVID arrived, we saw this increase in park use, and we were really interested in how that might translate to urban natural areas. And so here in New York City, we saw restrictions getting put in place. We saw playgrounds being locked up. People couldn't really visit places, public parkland that, you know, might put people at risk, but most of the natural areas stayed open. So a lot of the hiking trails stayed open. And even for myself personally, I live on a block with one tree, and I'm about 20-minute walk from a big park, Prospect Park. And I found myself really going there almost every night to try to get out of my apartment, get some fresh air. I don't have a backyard. And we saw this pattern across the city. And so our natural areas in New York are scattered across all 5 boroughs, and people were visiting them for the very first time. So people were looking at maps, trying to figure out how can I safely get outside and experience nature. At the same time, or a year earlier, a program that I run called the Forest and Cities program has been trying to bring people together that focus on natural areas forest management. So it's a pretty niche type of urban forestry, but we were at this time connected with about 12 cities across the US and had been sharing case studies and communicating with one another. And we had these partnerships, and so we were really interested in reaching out to them to see if they were experiencing these patterns as well. There's more about that program on our website, but what we did was we sent a survey out to these 12 cities in May of 2020 and asked a variety of questions, but around 3 central themes. We asked, have you observed any changes in use in parkland? So increase or decrease in use or no change? How has the pandemic impacted your ability to care for natural areas? So a lot of our foresters and technicians were, especially in the early days of the lockdown, staying at home. And so a lot of the basic maintenance and care was not happening. And we quickly saw hiring freezes here in New York get put in place as we were losing tax revenue and kind of on the brink of a budget crisis for the city. And so we also asked them, have you experienced or anticipate any changes in funding or budget? So across our 12 cities, which we realized, is a pretty small sample, especially seeing Francesca, you're a really large sample. But I think this pattern, could hold true across many cities. So across our 12 cities, we saw 83% reporting and observed increase in use during the pandemic. And there are some quotes below from some of our city team. So, more people are using all of the parks, but especially natural areas and trail systems as they try to stay close to home. People are more intentionally using their natural areas and seeking them out. People are doing new activities, and people are really feeling anxious during this time and are looking for a place to kind of relax and get into nature. So we really saw our natural areas serving as a place of respite and comfort and destination for people living in cities. 72% of our cities reported a decrease in their ability to care for natural areas, and this kind of went around a few different categories. So you know, just a general ability, decrease in ability to care for natural areas. 100% had canceled public programs, which I'm sure, you know, is happening across cities everywhere. You know, volunteer events were decreased. Tree planting events, which typically happen in the spring and fall here in the US, those were impacted, and then research and monitoring efforts were also impacted. So across the board, a lot of changes in programming and abilities to care and manage natural areas. And then 72% also reported that their budget had been impacted due to the pandemic. And so this was pretty early on too. This was in May. So that was, you know, just a few months in here in the US. And we're actually planning to follow up with these organizations a year later to see sort of what happened with their budget. But I know here in New York City, we had 40 seasonal staff, which was a big number for us, that their lines were not renewed. And so they were forest technicians out there managing the forest, and the city wasn't able to rehire them. And so it changed the staffing for the city from about 50 people to about 10 for the year of 2020. So 72% said their budget had been impacted. No one had at that time cut any full-time staff, but a lot of the seasonal staff, 61% said summer seasonal hiring had been impacted. And then 17% were confident that their budget would have adequate funding in 2021. So I think there was a lot of uncertainty in this time about, you know, what was going to happen and sort of how cities were going to handle this crisis. And I know now in New York, where the mayor just announced last week that they're going to try to put a green jobs, you know, COVID crisis task force out for this summer, which is great. But yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty during May of 2020. And we'll plan to follow up with these cities this May as well. So some key takeaways: natural areas are a unique and important resource in cities across the US. And during COVID, natural areas have been a place that people have really valued and maybe come to appreciate in a greater way. But the ability to care for them really decreased. So there was sort of this paradox that there were so many more people experiencing natural areas, which was so great that, you know, that natural areas existed, but the cuts in staffing and budget were really impacting the ability to care for them. So I'll leave it there, and happy to answer any questions once we get to the discussion portion. And please feel free to email me with any questions.
Perfect, Clara. Thank you so much. That's a fascinating study, and I really appreciate the work you've done also to look at the other side of the story, right? The management side of things, and to see actually that there's this contradiction. On the one hand, a growing importance of especially these natural areas, and on the other hand, lowering budgets, and 17% of the organization saying they expect less money in 2021, which is yeah, pretty scary in a way. Yeah. So thanks so much. And from there on, we'll actually move all the way over to the other side of the world. We're going to Malaysia. And the next speaker, Dr. Sritaran Marutaviran, is somebody I know pretty well, because he was actually back in the days doing his PhD in my group in Copenhagen, which was wonderful. And Sri did work then on the perceived safety in urban parks in Malaysia, but has since done a lot of different studies on various aspects of urban green spaces and health. He's a senior lecturer in the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University Putra, Malaysia, and is also, as he proudly says, a certified ISA certified arborist, and is very active in the arboriculture and urban forestry movement in Malaysia. Sri, thanks so much for joining us at this late evening time for you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Cecil. Thank you, and hi to all of you. This was a study conducted in March last year, where the number of cases were at the peak, actually. When I say the number of cases at the peak, I mean, of course, I mean, it was not as high as many of our neighboring countries in Southeast Asia. Though, however, there was this fear among the public on this pandemic, and also the concern from the government. So, of course, the government, the Malaysian government, have took imposing measures in terms of quarantine, and also months of public lockdowns In fact, we had several versions of lockdowns actually. Last March, we were not allowed to even leave our homes except to get some essential items, your foods and groceries and so on. The schools were shut and many of us were working from home. So though the use of quarantines and restrictions in the use of public spaces play a critical role for the promotion of the public health safety. However, it has negative implications, particularly on the mental and physical health of the leisure and recreational users. If you look at the image on your right, I think not only Malaysian, I think almost all of us have gone through this kind of lifestyle during the pandemic. So all these types of restrictions, for example, self-isolation, quarantines, and even lockdowns, of course, it's been a very unpleasant experience for most of us. So it's not just involves the separation from the loved ones, but it also have affected our daily lives and so on. That may have led increase in loneliness, anxiety, depression, and so on. In fact, there's also other issues. For example, people were gaining weight during the pandemic, and also many were also having with all these domestic violent cases, particularly between husband and wife. The number of divorce cases was also rising up. So furthermore, many were also jobless and homeless. So this has actually led to depression, suicide, and also self-harm. Furthermore, the COVID-19 pandemic has also placed unprecedented restriction on the physical activity. Many cities in the world, of course, even Kuala Lumpur, have shut down most of their public spaces, including parks, playgrounds, and so streets. So leaving many people without any place to conduct their leisure and recreational activities. So this is important because certain level of activity and exercise need to maintain an adequate status to counteract the negative consequences of certain diseases such as dementia, cardiovascular diseases, overweight, and also obesity. So with that, an online survey was conducted by using a Google form. So what I did was I managed to find all these recreational and leisure groups in the social media, for example, through the Facebook and WhatsApp. As you can see, I managed to find a few groups, for example, like the cycling group in Kuala Lumpur, the Kota Damansara Community Forest, Penang mountain bike riders, and the yoga group in Kuala Lumpur. So what I did was just send this link, which has the questionnaire and so on. It was an online questionnaire. So I got a good responses from them. In total, about 606 responses. And I managed to get in a week, actually, about 606. So these are some of the demographic results. 87% of the respondents were from urban. And apart from these questions, I even asked about the type of the houses they were living. This is just to find some correlations, actually, based on the type of houses they were living with the status of their mental health and also their physical health. So overall, I mean, the level of physical and mental health among the leisure and recreational users in Malaysia was moderately disrupted. This might be true because though we had several versions of lockdowns in the country, but along the way, actually, we were given all these, I would say, privileges, I mean, to meet with our loved ones on and off, actually. So it was not a total lockdown from March till December. So it was a moderately disrupted among the users, actually. And these are some of the physical activities that were conducted during the confinement period. It's nice to see, actually, where you have a list of activities over here. So so this shows that basically all the recreational and also the leisure users were able to cope during the pandemic. I mean, while they were in their homes, by conducting several activities. And of course, doing the household chores and also walking the house was rated the high. And apart from the physical activities, I even asked about what form of mental activity do they do when they were during the pandemic or the lockdown. And again, we got a list of them, and quite interesting. I mean, one interesting part that I would like to highlight in here that I think apart from the bad side that we look at this pandemic, I think there's also the good side of it, where we can see it seems that communicating with your families and friends were considered one of the mental activities that to reduce, I mean, all these mental problems or stresses among those users. So I think most of us, I think we have experienced this during the pandemic, where it actually increases the bond, I think, among our families and also relatives during the pandemic even more. And I even did this one test. This is a general health questionnaire. It's a self-administered questionnaire for identifying the non-psychotic or also minor psychiatric disorder. This is a common practice, I think, among the medical doctors. I think they wish to screen the individuals for the minor psychiatric disorder. And if you see in here, the first 6 of the items are the positive statements, and the next is more on the negative statements. And if you see the values over here, we can tally back with all those all sorts of activities that they were doing while they were at home. So basically, what I would say in here that the leisure and recreation users in Malaysia, they were able to take the pressure actually. For example, if we see from these items, they were capable of making decisions and able to face problems compared to the negative items below, where they scored even much lower actually. Okay, so what are some of the emerging questions from this pandemic? Perhaps what I would like to highlight in here, perhaps some questions from the design perspective. For example, are we ready to redesign our parks, or are we ready to even redesign our streets, and also even in terms of the arrangement of the facilities, for example, the benches in the park, and then the locations of these playgrounds in the park. This is important because urban nature has been seen as a source of resilience actually for many during the COVID-19 pandemic. Yeah, with that, I would like to conclude my presentation, and thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sri. Terima kasih. Excellent. Really nice to see those results. And it's also fascinating to see the things that people were doing inside the home to keep themselves into some kind of shape. I know my neighbor upstairs, he likes to walk around back and forth, stamping the floor. So that's definitely happening, I think, to some of us. And I really liked also that you pointed at some of these directions for possible redesign and transformation of urban areas, because that's a nice segue into the next and final presentation of this webinar by Jordi Honey-Roses. And Jordi is a good colleague of mine from the University of British Columbia. He's cheating a little bit because he has a great background there showing Vancouver, but I know he is actually here in Barcelona with me. He spends part of his time here. He is originally from this area. Jordi is an associate professor at the School of Community and Regional Planning at UBC, and has worked in the US, in Canada, in Spain, as well as in Mexico, and has a very big interest in things like ecosystem services, socio-ecological systems, as well as the planning and redesigning of our urban areas. So Jordi, thanks so much for joining, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Cecil. It was wonderful to present to this group. As Cecil mentioned, I'm a faculty member in the planning school at the University of British Columbia. I do work in environmental planning, but I'm really going to be putting my urban planner hat on today and looking at these issues from that perspective. And like Francesca, so the title is The Impact of COVID on Public Space. That's really the question that I'll be looking at and thinking through with you. Like Francesca, I'd like to begin with this photo of my daughters when we were in lockdown. We came to Barcelona last year on sabbatical. I was here on a research sabbatical from Vancouver, and we rented a very small apartment thinking that we would spend all our time outdoors and in the beautiful public squares and plazas that are so common in this part of the Mediterranean. And we found ourselves in lockdown, in a very severe lockdown, like Francesca described. We were fortunate to have a small balcony. And in in terms, I was thinking about what I would have answered about what my activities were during lockdown. It's basically two. It's either taking care of the kids or working or responding to emails. I mean, there's basically no other activity other than those two. And so when I was taking care of the kids, it would be great to be out on the balcony, and I had my notebook, and I started to look at these deserted spaces that lasted for several weeks. And I really started to think about what was the impact of the COVID pandemic on public space. Very early on in March, April, my wife, who's also urban planners, told me, oh, there's not going to be any impact. Cities are going to be exactly the same, and we're going to move on as before. And I thought, wait, maybe so, maybe not. And so this question about what changes will be permanent and what will be temporary, right? What is really got me going. And I was in contact with others from around the world, and I realized that other parts of the world were experiencing something very different. I mean, I remember actually when Clara, you had a slide there where it said, you're in a pandemic, go for a walk. And I remember thinking, no way in hell, we're not allowed to go for a walk. There were helicopters monitoring parks, making sure that no one was leaving the city. So very different experience. And so I started to bring together a group of very diverse scholars thinking about what the impact might be. And we had scholars from Mexico and Chile and India. We had an incoming student from Wuhan. It was very interesting hearing her perspective. And we were all thinking on this question of what might be the impact of the pandemic on public space. And we came up with these questions. I'm not going to go over all of them. It's an interesting article to read because it's already dated. We've already, a lot of the answers to these questions, many of the presenters just before me are already starting to answer, and you can really feel that it has a very April 2020 feel to it. Two of the questions that I did want to share with this group are in bold here. One is about our intuitive caring capacity for public spaces, and will that change? So some of you who do more urban research may be familiar with this fellow named William White, a New Yorker like Clara. He's looked at public spaces from the tops of buildings. He actually filmed them, looked at plazas, and observed how people moved when they came out and had lunch in these public squares in the business district. And we observed, he came out with this hypothesis that public spaces have a care capacity, that intuitively, when we go to a public square or plaza, or when they were sitting on the steps, that there was a maximum number of people which would congregate. And when it reached that carrying capacity, they would go somewhere else. They'd go to another bench, or they'd go to another corner. And so my question is, well, does this pandemic make us more sensitive to how many people are in a particular space? And is our carrying capacity, or is our intuition about this carrying capacity changing? And then, of course, the other question I think that might be interesting for this group is about and has already been mentioned, is sort of green space planning, new designs, uses, practices, and a lot of work already is being done and making progress on that question. So one sort of evolution of these questions that I like to propose to this group is about how the pandemic might be recalibrating our expectations of urban green spaces, right? So pre-pandemic, we had certain expectations, notions about what green spaces were for, how we use them. Is the pandemic creating a structural shift in our perceptions? And in other words, are there fundamental changes between perceptions today from how they were a few years back? Expectations about how much green space is appropriate, how green it should be, or how it should be designed, how close green spaces should be. Again, Francesca is already talking about this. Who has access to green spaces? And the who, I think is very important in terms of gender, but also in terms of racial justice. My Canadian students have done some very interesting work on issues of who has access, and I'd like to share a video at the end. I'll put it in the chat back on the chat box about sort of who is accessing. Is it just the white privileged who are going to these green spaces? Are those who are in disadvantaged backgrounds, do they have access? And then finally, what is crowded, right? Getting back to this issue about William White and our carrying capacity, what does it mean is it crowded? Are we more sensitive to other users in space? And of course, this issue of crowded, actually, I have done a little bit of research on crowding from an urban perspective. And if you look at the urban planners look at crowding, it's a really dated literature. You know, in the 70s, they were talking about, you know, how crowding is really bad for people, living in cities, being surrounded by people, but that literature really dies off. You know, psychologists, urban planners, they stopped talking about the sort of the harms of crowding. My sense is that it's really been pushed forward by this community of sort of recreational scholars, right? And those who publish in leisure science and study protected areas. You know, I think of fellows named Manning and Wolfgang Heider, who passed away, but as SFU, studying crowding in parks. And that's really been the crowd that's been advancing our understanding of perceptions of crowding. Crowding, of course, is relative, right? So you can have the same number of people in a space that's designed differently, and your sensation of crowding might be different, right? And so I'm wondering if post-pandemic, urban planners will be revisiting issues of crowding, and it will be taken more seriously. And it won't just be something that's looked at by recreational scientists who are looking at beaches in Croatia or islands in the Mediterranean, but it'll be taken much more seriously by a larger group of scholars and practitioners. And this question of total use of urban green space, I think will gain more salience. Pre-pandemic, I was involved in a research project, or led a research project, that looked at what the impact of adding more people in a public space, how it might change perceptions, and how it might change sort of the benefits of being in a green space. And we did an experiment, which is sort of rare in planning. We actually experimentally added people to a green street. So again, this is the street that we're looking at. I'm considering it a green street. It's not a park. But it is quite green. After all, we're in Vancouver, and I'm looking at how the perceptions of safety and comfort and stress relief and mood might change when we add more people. So this is all pre-pandemic work, but I think it's quite relevant. So our question was how the addition of more users in urban green spaces might change self-reported measures of well-being. And what we did was, like I said, experiment. We randomly chose hours in the working day in which we added people. So we added students who were given a particular role to either be walking through the green street or to be using electronics. And then we measured who stays around, who stays, and who leaves, right? So urban planners might think that if you add more people, it'll give you a more lively environment and more people will be more likely to stay. But we weren't sure that was going to be the case exactly. And then we also looked at issues of mood and stress and sort of general perceptions of public space. And since we have an experiment, we have very good causal inference, right? We can clearly see what the impact of adding more people into this space is to changes in perceptions, right? And we find that, as perhaps maybe those who study green spaces will not be surprised, but actually people didn't like it when there was more individuals packed into that area. So in the typical conditions, their self-reported levels of stress were lower rather than with people went up. And their mood was dampened when there were more people. People really, they liked it when it was quiet and calm. And importantly, there were gender differences. Most importantly, there were gender differences in staying behavior. So women in the space, when it was open and we didn't add people, women were dominant. Most women stayed when it was quiet. But when we added more individuals, women fled, and by a significant margin. And so when you walk down this green street, you would never think it's a gendered space or that there's any gender dynamics at all. But yet, just by the very fact that we were adding more people changed that. And we were able to see that there were important gender differences. So again, this is pre-pandemic research, and I think it will be getting more attention. Again, issues of total use. Just to recap here, the pandemic may recalibrate expectations about urban green spaces, expectations in general, and the partners have already discussed to this effect. We might be refocusing more attention on issues of total use, sort of who's in there and how many. And our research shows that sort of the health benefits of green spaces in terms of mood and stress are moderated by the total number of users. Again, the total number of users, I think, becoming a more important variable that we should be thinking about. And we also have now experimental evidence that men and women respond differently to the increasing use of urban green spaces, or in this case, specifically green streets. These are just the references. I just wanted to point out at the bottom here, there's this link that on pandemic urbanism created by students at the University of Columbia that has the most amazing bibliography on everything pandemic and urban you can possibly think of. I highly recommend you visit that link there. And maybe Cecil can find a way to share the slide so you can have the links as well. So with that, I will stop sharing. And thank you everyone.
Thank you very much, Jordi. Wonderful talk and some real thought-provoking material there in terms of, for example, re-looking or reconsidering the whole crowding aspect and also the total use of green spaces. So one thing I think that many of us have seen is kind of zoning over time, right? That some cities even instilled on green spaces, or certain age groups were allowed to go in green space in certain times of the day. So yeah, it's a really interesting question. So I won't go too far into it because then I'll already take the thunder away from many of you in the discussion. But great talks. Thanks for everybody also for staying inside the time. It was fantastic. A few questions have come in, and I've seen that Clara, for example, has already been answering a little bit. So I'll start with one of the questions that has not been answered yet. A question from Rogelio from the Philippines. He says that in the Philippines, there has been a trend of people starting to do more home gardening and to start bringing nature into their homes. And then actually some of the other colleagues commented on similar trends from other Asian countries. So any of the panelists would like to comment on that? Do you see similar patterns in your countries? Maybe, I don't know, Clara from New York, have you experienced anything like that?
I don't know. We haven't studied that. I've definitely observed people doing a little bit more gardening, even sort of in our local green spaces. We have a program that I know the Green Thumb, which is our community park or community garden group. They've been at capacity and are on a waiting list. And then within the apartments, I know, this is only anecdotally, but I know a lot of my friends have started growing herbs, lettuces, and fruits and stuff inside their apartment. But we didn't study that in our study.
Right, thank you. Yeah, Francesca?
I think there is a publication maybe made by a colleague of Giovanni Sanesi, and I read it some months ago, and it seems that there was at least much more internet search of gardening tools and gardening stuff, from people, let's say. So there is probably much more interest and much more time to spend in the balcony or outdoors where it's allowed.
Yeah, we done a survey as well, which was a global survey. We had about 2,300 responses from all over the world, where one of the things we saw was a pattern in increased appreciation of indoor plants. People spend more time with their plants, for example, which was interesting. And actually there was an increase also in the percentage of people talking with their plants, or talking to their plants, I guess. So there are some interesting trends there. We hope to get that published as well in the near future. Francesca, if I can stay with you, there was also a question from Annabelle asking about, in your study, if you saw any patterns in terms of people maybe preferring spending longer times in larger green spaces, or was it more like frequent short visits to smaller green spaces like pocket parks?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And let's say that in the study that have been published, there were so many data from many countries that we didn't, let's say, make some correlations among, let's say, such variables. But we are publishing another paper only about the Italian data. And it seems, I mean, that there is, let's say that, well, there is, I mean, it seems that the pattern is that people reach the green space that they expect, let's say, that for the motivation or for the reason that they want to they want to perform, let's say, in the park. If they go for running, they prefer bigger size green spaces, and they are even, let's say, willing to reach farther distances. But in general, it seems also that there is a need of closer green spaces. It doesn't matter the size of the green space. So maybe, let's say, in general, the urban planning should search for a trade-off between what is needed near home, but also increase the size of parks, or something that is already big, but make it a little bit bigger. Yeah, this is what we understood, I mean, from this analysis. And to respond also, there was another question also from Annabelle asking about the perception of living in a village and living in a town, a big town. And to answer this question again, from the Italian sample, what we found out is that especially the deprivation feeling was surely higher in the people that live in towns, in big towns, especially in big towns, and in the red zones. That, I mean, those that at that time were the serious, I mean, red zones with the number of infections, I mean, a number of positive cases was really high, especially in the northern part of the country. And we found the correlations, and this was really clear. Who lives in town actually suffers more than those who live in a small village, where probably the green area is just around. So yes, this was very clear.
Great. Jordi, do you have any experience? I mean, being both in North America and in Barcelona, do you see, and I know your family, right? You visited the countryside here in Catalonia, for example. Do you see different ways of people interacting with nature during the pandemic?
Yeah, you know, I don't know if I can add anything that's any different than you know, again, it's anecdotal, my experience. You know, everyone's going local, right? Everyone is. Someone who mentioned pulling out a map and looking for what's in their neighborhood or in their community. I think that's really happened all over the world, and I'm curious to know, again, how will that translate into political change? You know, how will all of these experiences ripple through our political system or our decision-making system? What's permanent and what's temporary, right? I mean, that's for me the interesting question. When we look back 10 years from now, what will be the transformations, the tipping points, or that threshold that we will identify in our respective fields as COVID really having changed? I still think, even though we're a year on, it's still unclear what those issues are. Clearly, there's a greater sensitivity to green spaces and nature and health. But will that sensitivity translate into fundamental ways of rethinking? I'm wondering if there's a new vocabulary, if there's a new way we talk about these topics, that would mark an important shift. I mean, you know, language does matter. I mean, I think about how we talk about when we talk about how we're much more efficient over Zoom and not working in the office, right? And I think we're missing something else. And I think what we're missing is a vocabulary to how we talk about this new efficiency. It's efficient, but yet it's inefficient for other items, right? Sort of the banter and the water cooler talk. And I think with green space issues, it may be as well, right? In the paper, you know, the part that you contributed, we talked about a new typology for describing green spaces. And I'm curious to see if that will emerge. That would, of course, be a major shift.
Yeah, there's really good points. I think that we probably will see develop, right? I saw the former Parks Commissioner of New York City, Mitchell Silver. He's actually talking about the new permanent is actually the temporary. So he definitely sees those trends, right? As a planner and somebody has been leading a big parks department. So really interesting. Sri, I would like to get to you as well. There were a couple of questions about increasing maybe political attention. Rashid, one of our colleagues from Africa, also asked, well, do you see trends of more green space being created? How is that in Malaysia? Are there trends towards regreening cities because of the pandemic, or is it business as usual?
Yeah, sure. So as for the Malaysians, I think people are getting into all these greening issues. People are into more about this community gardening, and also I think there's an increase in the health awareness. They're more concerned about their health. I think people are discussing about how to get more fit and how to go back to your routines, like for example, going back to your gyms and all these things. So the issue of I think perhaps there's a small increase in the awareness. Actually, I mean, of course, the awareness has been there in terms of the health conscious and so on, but I think people are becoming more aware, and the issue of about the health status and so on, I mean, it's been discussed a lot in Malaysia. And in fact, there was also this strong push, I mean, from the public to all these politicians in Malaysia, I mean, to even open the green spaces as soon as possible during the pandemic, because we had this on and off kind of thing. You were allowed in certain time and you were not allowed, and so on. So there was this great pressure, especially from these active leisure and recreational users, to give a pressure to these politicians to open all these green spaces in Kuala Lumpur, particularly as soon as possible. Yeah.
Great. We'll take one or two more questions. I realize that we hit the time that was supposed to end. So if anybody has to go, obviously go, including our speakers. I understand if you have something else. But there was an interesting question here also from Purabi Bose, who is the deputy coordinator in our division, asking about the impact of urban green space, and also during the pandemic, which could be different on the urban poor, for example. I don't know if anybody would like to comment on that aspect, right? So we see, of course, in general already a difference in provision of green spaces. Many people were worse off. They have not had the same access to green space. Have you seen patterns like that in the places you're living and working? And I'm not really looking at anybody in particular, but maybe, I don't know, Sri, maybe from Malaysian perspective, right? Do you see, I mean, remember from Kuala Lumpur that the city is pretty different. So some parts are pretty green, some parts are less green. So do you see issues with that in terms of provision of green space to everybody?
I think what most of the people they want now is perhaps green areas near to their homes, actually. Because in Kuala Lumpur, though we have several parks in the cities, but most of these parks are scattered. And they are big parks. We have really big parks in Kuala Lumpur, but the issues in most of these parks, they're scattered, I mean, in the cities actually. I mean, of course, the issue of connectivity is there. And on top of that, public are also asking more green spaces, perhaps near to their homes actually.
That's very interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
I can
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Clara.
I was just going to add a quick reflection on that. I think one of the things we've noticed in New York and our organization has thought about is access to natural areas, you know, which is a type of green space, but it's not evenly distributed across the city. And in some ways it's very fixed. It's hard to create a new forest in a really densely populated place. And so we've seen that there is some inequitable access to different types of green spaces, and you know, some neighborhoods have access to really big parks, and I think that has really been a focus in terms of some of the equity conversations moving forward, is how to increase access. But also, once you're within a park, how do you make the access feel safe for everybody and open and welcome for everybody? So that I think COVID has brought that question to the forefront more.
Yeah, maybe it's a little bit of a almost connected issue. Lisa Turvine was mentioning this, that Finnish studies show that especially women have shown a greater appreciation for urban nature, urban green spaces during the pandemic. Is that something you've seen as well, Francesca, in your work? A higher appreciation, higher use rate by women compared to men?
Actually, it's another work is being carried out by me together with a researcher from Iran, and who is here. So
great,
and he's enjoying. And in this study, there was a really great appreciation by women. Yeah, yes, for nature. Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah, and one can, of course, again, speculate, but knowing also some of the other research, right, that especially during the pandemic, there's been an increase on carrying tasks often put on women in the household, which might have led to greater stress levels that we've also seen in some research, which could explain maybe also the need for escapes and for finding stress relief, etc. But that's speculative, of course, but I'm sure the research will come out in this direction.
Yeah,
Right.
I just want to
Go
add,
ahead,
just to
Jordi.
echo the importance of the gender differences that clearly came out in all the dimensions of our work and our experiment. Again, the user, those who were being asked, didn't realize they were part of an experiment, but there were very clear gender differences in both the perceptions of the public space, in this case at Green Street, and also the behavioral response in terms of who stayed and who lingered. And those, I mean, we anticipated perhaps some gender differences, but not the extent or not the significance that what we saw. And so I'm glad that others are looking at that further, because it is,
Great.
it's clearly there.
Thank you. Was Alan Simpson, did you have a question? Sorry, did you raise your hand?
Well, yes, I did. I don't want to make things go on much longer than they should do. Thinking of gender, it's quite noticeable, I think, in the UK, that the number of ladies who are taking dogs out for walks far exceeds blokes. You still see the odd bloke, but mainly dog walking is done by ladies. And obviously they're in the parks and what have you. And the other interesting thing, I think, about green space in the sort of poorer areas, if you like, the protection of trees by tree preservation orders in about the last 5 months in the UK has gone up over 30%. That local authorities are putting preservation orders on healthy, mature trees, mainly because the communities are saying, why aren't these protected? And you've got climate change stuff, but you're not protecting the things that are really going to help you. Inevitably, most of those trees are not in the poorest areas where obviously there's great terraced housing and there isn't the space for trees. So even now, things are sort of widening between the profitable areas and the less so. But certainly all the discussion at the moment is about how new design should be fairly easy. It shouldn't be that difficult. How do you actually retrofit the existing urban areas? And that's what most of us are talking about at the moment.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Alan, for sharing that. That's great. By the way, Jordi has already uploaded this presentation. We'll try to find a way to both post these presentations as well as the recording on the IUFRO Division 6 website. So more information about that will come, because I know many people were not able to follow this live. I think I need to start closing this up as well, because I realize everybody's busy and many people are actually starting to enjoy the weekends or moving into their weekends, or have already started this morning. So we should be fair to that. Can I first of all thank the speakers once again for their fantastic sharing of knowledge and experiences, and also for posing some really interesting questions, I think, for future research. Much appreciated that you made time for this. Thanks, of course, to all of you for participating from all over the world. We had many different countries involved, which is really great to see. And I encourage you, of course, to be active in IUFRO's Division 6, the Social Science Division in IUFRO. We're going to do this more often. So we have a plan to do this every second month. And probably the next session that we do will have to do with gender issues related to forest and maybe also related to the pandemic. We're still trying to scope it out. And actually some of the questions that came up today show that there is an interest in the kind of the gender differences here in terms of how urban green spaces have been used. So thanks again, all of you. I wish you all a wonderful weekend. Stay healthy and hope that at some occasion in a not too distant future, we'll see each other in person again. Thanks, everybody. See you.
Thank you, Cecil.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Brilliant, mate.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Cheers, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Nice
much.
weekend.
Bye.
Bye.